Hey guys, welcome to GED Social Studies Level 1. So we'll have 4 of these for social studies and for all the other 3 subjects as well. So 4 practice tests. So level 1 is for most people, as far as how many they get correct, do better on level 1 than level 2. Same thing as you go on. So level 4 is the hardest, level 1 is the easiest. So there's 20 questions in the description. So what I would recommend is going ahead and answering those questions first, then going and watching the video to see the reasoning for the answers and also what the correct answers are. We also have an app, a mobile app, link also in the description. It's helped out a lot of people getting prepared for the GED, so I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. Free to install, and it will customize short little videos as you answer, so it will figure out where your knowledge gaps are and help you to know which videos to watch, plus getting to answer hundreds if not thousands of questions that are just like the GED. And with that, let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, so I usually want to talk about the score part for a second as well. Maybe you already know this, but a lot of people don't. So you need to get at least a 145 on each subject to get your GED. So what that means, what does 145 mean? Is kind of like your minimum score there to pass is somewhere around 60 to 65%. So to give yourself a little room for error, on the practices, like I would be thinking at least like 75 or 80% is what I would be going for. And remembering this is level 1, so most people do find these a little bit easier. So you'd be looking to do pretty well here on this one. And so it just gives you a little bit of reference of where you stand going in. So if you get a score that's not, it's below 65%, don't stress out about it, right? We have a lot of shorter videos that we'll link to also in the description. There's a lot in the description. So check those out, right? And those will go over more specifics and, start using the app. So you get to, get practice at answering a lot of questions, getting a lot of feedback, building up your knowledge base, and then you'll be ready for it. No question. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started here. So what global event helped put an end to the Great Depression? Okay. So we like to know, kind of like as we start, Great Depression is 1930s and into the 1940s, and even just that information should help us to think it must be World War II. Like we just sort of know some of these dates, like Vietnam's not till the 1960s. But for some information, during the war, meaning World War II, more than 12 million Americans were sent into the military, and a similar number worked in defense-related jobs. This seems to have taken care of about 17 million unemployed in 1939. So most historians will cite the spending at the beginning of World War II as the event that ended the Great Depression. Get my pen going. So there we go, World War II. That's a pretty common question there. Jumping ahead to the second one. What ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers, thus ending World War I? Okay, so we want to be familiar with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so that's a big moment in history, and that treaty is what ended World War I. The treaty blamed Germany for the war. The treaty forced Germany to disarm, make substantial territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries that had formed their powers. In 1921, the total cost of these reparations was 132 billion marks. The unconditional surrender of the Axis powers ended World War II, but not World War I. So it's answer C. So that's the end of World War II. The Neutrality Acts were laws passed in 1935, 36, 37, and 1939 to limit U.S. involvement in future wars. Okay, so there's some information about the incorrect answer choices, as well as some basics on the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so with all that detail, really what you want to have locked into your mind is the Treaty of Versailles is what ended World War I. Okay, a Hitler question. Public apathy has been attributed as a cause for Hitler's rise to power. Okay, so public apathy helped Hitler and the Nazis rise to power. So that's one that you kind of want to commit to memory, almost word for word. That's probably a question. All right, question 4. Which of the following was not a reason for the Great Depression? Okay, so what that means obviously is that 3 of these things are a reason. So with answer choice D, which is our answer. Whoop, where's my pen? With bank failures. So bank failures, a lot of people go for that answer choice. They were a result of the Great Depression, but did not cause it. Right? So we want to make sure that we look carefully at some of these questions because that can be, so a reason is similar to cause, right? But not a result. So what's known as laissez-faire economics is important to know. And so until the Great Depression, the United States took a hands-off approach to the economy, and that's one of the biggest reasons for the Great Depression happening. So we want to be very familiar with that. So you can see answer choice C, laissez-faire economics definitely contributed to the Great Depression, right? And laissez-faire economics means just hands off, like they didn't try to mess with it like you would see today. And then also income disparity between the classes was big, and an increase in the level of debt for many Americans throughout the Roaring Twenties. Okay, all those things led to the Great Depression. Question 5. The U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War was shaped by the JFK assassination, preventing the spread of communism, economics, all of the above. Okay, so we want to know, this concept is tested. You just see it show up in one form or another pretty consistently. Right, and so if you just sort of think this through, though, so say we need to know this answer, that preventing the spread of communism was a big deal in this period of time, right? 1950s and into the 1960s. It's a big deal in the U.S. So the JFK assassination has really nothing to do with the Vietnam War. Economics has really nothing to do with the Vietnam War. But preventing the spread of communism was definitely a big deal. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor can be considered an immediate catalyst for the end of World War II, U.S. entry into World War II, British aggression, U.S. entry into World War I. Okay, so we want to be familiar with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it led the U.S. into entering World War II. Okay, so that's a very famous or perhaps infamous day in U.S. history. And we want to make sure that we know that's how we entered World War II, but has nothing to do with World War I, and it was certainly not the end of World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was successful because it moved government away from laissez-faire economic policies. So there we hear that term again, right? So especially when we start hearing terms over and over again on these practice tests, is we should really think, okay, that means like the chance that this shows up is really, really high. Okay, so again, remembering laissez-faire economic policies, that means hands off. Okay, regulated speculation in the stock market. So if you just sort of think this out, so Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and even if you've never heard of it before, it's telling you that it was successful, right? Okay, so did it regulate speculation in the stock market? Did it balance the federal budget? Did it end the Great Depression? So let's go through this. So the actual answer is choice A. So again, we're on this laissez-faire thing. So move the government away from laissez-faire economic policies. There are many parts of the New Deal that were positive. Laissez-faire economic policies meant that government left businesses and the economy alone, right? Again, hands off. The New Deal accelerated the move away from these policies. The nature of the stock market is that it's speculative, and that was not changed by the New Deal. The New Deal definitely did not balance the federal budget. Roosevelt more than doubled the national debt with the New Deal. And he didn't end the Great Depression either, although that is an answer choice that a lot of people go for. In 1939, the unemployment rate was still 19%, and not until 1943 did it reach pre-Depression levels. Right? And remembering, ended the Great Depression. So we already looked at this question, right? Or that basic term. What is it that ended the Great Depression? And it was our entry into World War II. Okay, I believe that was one of our first questions, maybe even the very first question. Okay, Black Tuesday. So that's another term that you want to know, right? And so Black Tuesday is the stock market crash of 1929. And that is usually by historians thought of as the beginning of the Great Depression. 16.4 million shares were sold on Black Tuesday. Stock prices were so low that nobody was willing to buy at practically any price. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 12% in one day. That was the beginning of the Great Depression. So Black Tuesday, beginning of the Great Depression, and it's the stock market crash. If you just know that, that's enough. And it's also a really common question. Big event in the 20th century in the US. The accepted trigger for World War I was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So we want to know that. The assassination led directly to the First World War when Austria-Hungary subsequently issued an ultimatum to the Kingdom of Serbia, which was partially rejected. Austria-Hungary then declared war, and World War I had begun. Again, so we see, so even in the answer choices, you can see, okay, bombing of Pearl Harbor. So yet again, we have Pearl Harbor, and knowing that that was the beginning of World War II, right? Important to know that. What primarily aided the rise of fascism in Europe in the first part of the 20th century? Okay, and so we want to know that the rise of fascism was primarily due to economics, right? Not technology or World War I or Hitler. So Hitler was a fascist, but that was not the primary reason why fascism rose in Europe. Poor economic conditions aided the rise of fascism more than anything else. Fascism was a response to the shocking rate of industrialization and was intended to have a focus on national unity with a focus on taking over other nations. Okay, so, but the economic part, that can definitely show up as a question. Right, all these very, very common questions, but at least the concepts that the questions are going over, very likely to show up. So important to know this stuff. Okay, so those first 10 were all sort of U.S. history, 20th century. Okay, and these next 10, more Cold War and some civil rights type stuff. Cold War ended in 1991 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, breakup of Soviet Union, unification of East and West Germany, collapse of various communist governments in Europe. Okay, so we need to know that the Cold War, right, was basically between approximately the end of World War II, we'll say like 1947-ish, and 1991, which was the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was primarily between Soviet Union and the United States, right? The Cold War ending in 1991 led to the end of communism in the Soviet Union. This in turn led to the fall of many communist governments in Eastern Europe, including the fall of the Berlin Wall, which had previously separated East and West Germany. Okay, so it's easy to think that it was the unification of East and West Germany, because time-wise that is pretty similar, or the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the principal thing that happened was the breakup of the Soviet Union ended Cold War. We may get to this, but it's called the Cold War because there was no bloodshed. Also important to know there. Okay. Brown versus Board of Education. You know, if I was saying of all the social studies questions, which one is the most likely to show up? This one is on like every single test I've ever seen. So we gotta know what this is. The Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas was significant in that it, repealed all the Jim Crow laws, led directly to Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, addressed the constitutionality of segregation in public schools, led to James Meredith becoming first African American student admitted to University of Mississippi. Okay, so we want to know that with the Supreme Court, the case of Brown versus Board of Education, that was a landmark case that addressed the constitutionality of segregation in public schools. Within quotes here, separate but equal education was determined to be unconstitutional. Jim Crow laws mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks. So all the Jim Crow laws were not repealed with Brown versus Board of Education. James Meredith was the first African American to attend the University of Mississippi, but it's not directly related to the Brown versus Board of Education case. So all that, hopefully we got the main point, right? So for all that I just read, right, Jim Crow laws do show up, right? And so it's important to be familiar with those, because otherwise we could get tricked into an answer that was incorrect. But the main point, Brown versus Board of Education, addressed the constitutionality of segregation in public schools, which meant that it was not legal to have just an all white school. The U.S. government viewed its involvement in the Vietnam War as necessary due to the Viet Cong guerrilla warfare. As important because it was an anti-communist ally of North Vietnam to help unify North and South Vietnam as a way to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. Okay, so that's a tricky question. So the correct answer is answer choice D, a way to prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam. Remembering when we're hearing about U.S. involvement in Vietnam and reasons why we're there, it's probably going to be about communism, right? The U.S. was very, very concerned about the spread of communism and this belief that, if it existed in one area, that it would spread to other areas. And they felt like, this was a real threat to democracy. For a little information, though, about the Vietnam War, it was fought between North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam, supported by the U.S., Philippines, and other anti-communist allies. The U.S. government viewed its involvement in the war as a way to prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese government and the Viet Cong were fighting to reunify Vietnam, but that was not the interest of the U.S. government. Okay. 14. Question 14. About 3/4 of the way through this one. The landmark civil rights law in the U.S. that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin was, and then we have these options. So we want to be familiar. We could be familiar with all of these, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a big one that you'll be tested on in one form or another. It would be nice if you knew that at least this one seems completely out of place, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, that's Abraham Lincoln, like a century before this time. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark civil rights and labor law in the U.S. that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also prohibited discriminatory application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. Okay, so that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We would like to be familiar with that one. Okay, so I referenced this a few questions ago. See if you remember. Why is it referred to as the Cold War? Okay, so frigid temperatures in Russia? No. Rising threat of communism to the U.S.? No. Due to the fact there was no large-scale fighting? Yes. Okay, so that is the main point of the Cold War. No direct combat. That's what we're thinking with Cold War. If you know that, that's great. Don't get, certainly not about cold weather. And it's not about communism directly either. Okay, so we can be asked about space race type of stuff. This is, again, another Cold War thing. Space race between the Soviet Union and the US was a big part of the Cold War. What event led to the beginning of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union? Okay, so we would like to be familiar with what Sputnik was. And that is our answer. So in 1957, a Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile launched what's called Sputnik, which is a Russian word that means traveler, which was the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. A couple years later, in 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon, on July 16th, 1969. U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Ed Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on Apollo 11 space mission. Armstrong, as is famously known, became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. By landing on the moon, the U.S. effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. Okay, so we want to know Sputnik was Soviet, and that marked really the beginning of the space race. If we know that, that's great. That's really what you're likely to be tested on. If you know what Luna 2 is, that's great. But it's very unlikely. It's likely that it might be an answer choice, but I'd be surprised that you were asked specifically about Luna 2. It's just more specific and detail oriented than this exam really gets. Neil Armstrong is tempting to pick because that's the name that people are the most familiar with. Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, but that is definitely not the beginning of the space race. What was the main goal of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society? Okay, so the Great Society had nothing to do with ending Vietnam, ending the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Okay, so it had nothing to do with that. It was a domestic program, meaning focused on what's going on in the U.S. But it did have a goal of both ending racial injustice and ending poverty in the United States. And so this was launched by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, 1965. Right, so in this time period is a big time period for civil rights in the U.S., including rights especially for African Americans and for women. The main goal, as we said, was the elimination of poverty and racial injustice. It's a very big goal, very hard to get there, right? New major spending programs that addressed education, medical care, urban problems, and rural poverty. The Great Society really in scope and sweep resembled the New Deal Domestic Agenda of Franklin Roosevelt. All right, let's hang in there. We got 3 left here. Plessy v. Ferguson. So occasionally we get a Supreme Court case, right? Only the most famous of them, but Plessy v. Ferguson is certainly one of the most famous Supreme Court cases ever. So we want to know, what was this? Okay, so the basis of Plessy v. Ferguson was that it upheld states' rights to enforce racial segregation. So you hear this term landmark constitutional case a few times, right? Like we said it with Brown versus Board of Education, which was a Supreme Court case as well. And same with Plessy v. Ferguson. It's a landmark constitutional law case. It upheld state racial segregation laws for public facilities under the doctrine of separate but equal. Separate but equal remained standard doctrine in U.S. law until the 1954 Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education, right? So there's definitely a connection there. What defense treaty did the Soviet Union create in reaction to NATO in 1955? A tougher question for level 1, but we are getting here towards the end of level 1. A little information here about the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact put the Soviet Union in command of the armed forces of the member states. The other states included Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. The treaty called on the member states to come to the defense of any member attacked by an outside force. West Germany became a member of NATO in 1955. This meant that West Germany could remilitarize. The Soviets saw this as a threat, and this is the main reason that the Warsaw Pact developed. And last question for level 1. Segregated restrooms and restaurants between the Reconstruction period, so that's right after the Civil War, and 1965 are the result of, and here we get into Jim Crow laws. Okay, so another big concept, right? So rather than like memorizing this specific question and the answer, is we want to be really more familiar with what are the Jim Crow laws. They were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern U.S. These laws continues to be enforced until about 1965. Segregation of public schools is a classic example of Jim Crow laws. Sectionalism was the reality that North and South had 2 different opinions about slavery prior to the Civil War. The Warren Court refers to the Supreme Court of the U.S. between 1953 and 1969, when Earl Warren served as Chief Justice. Warren led a liberal majority that used judicial power in dramatic fashion. Plessy v. Ferguson, which was in 1896, which we just talked about, was a landmark constitutional law case. So you want to kind of have that phrase in your mind if possible. Plessy v. Ferguson, it's a constitutional law case, very famous. And that it upheld the doctrine of separate but equal, right? So whenever you see Plessy v. Ferguson, if you can be thinking Supreme Court case, separate but equal, right? If you can be thinking that, you're in good shape. All right, so that gets us to the end of the level 1 practice test. So if you have any questions or anything doesn't make sense that we've gone over, definitely leave a comment and we will respond and try to be as helpful as we can. And hopefully we will see you on one of the other practice tests. So if you did well here, check out level 2 next.